The angry god Apollo compressed space and he became invisible. This is according to ancient Greek mythology and the pantheon of the Greek gods. In verse 43 to 52 of the Iliad, Homer describes the descent of the angry Apollo from Olympus and the outburst of his wrath on the Achaeans. The image has amazing power, compressing the space. Since it does not describe the path followed by Apollo, the poet stands in the sound and visual echo of the god's movements. With every move of Apollo, the arrows thunder on him, and he looks like the knight as he moves towards the camp of the Achaeans. The audible and visible echoes continue even when the god stops walking and sits, quote, opposite the ships, end quote. So we now see the first arrow go, and we hear the terrible echo coming out of the silver bow. Next, we see the bitter spears leave one behind the other, but now the sound impression has shifted to the camp of the Achaeans, since we can easily imagine the cries of agony and pain caused by the arrows of the god Apollo. The image closes with an almost dumb visual impression. The fires of the dead are burning everywhere. Let us dwell for a moment on the words and phrases that dominate the image. Came down, or went down. Angry, dripping wax. Bow, all around quiver, ambiguous quiver. The arrows roared, a weeping one weeps. Colomenos, digging. It was like night, night's home. Awful horror, mournful wailing. Bitter spears, arrow, and dead fires. The description begins with the descent of the angry god from Mount Olympus. Both the downward movement and the anger of Apollo foretell nothing good. Of course, we suspect from the moment he heard the prayers of Chrysis that God will punish the Achaeans, but we do not know the magnitude of the punishment. The fact that Apollo comes down angry is a first sign. It's important that the ancient text, the poet does not simply say buried or anger equals to angry, but buried wax equals bitter, angry, anger in its heart. The word wax, the wax, is used by Homer mainly to denote the heart as the seat of the will. At the same time, however, in Homer again, the word Keri, denotes the goddess of death or doom, who wanders the battlefields wearing clothes red dripping with blood. The descent of the angry Apollo from Mount Olympus to the heart could recall in the memory of the ancient listener the descent of Candle on the battlefield. This view is supported by the fact that Apollo is armored with a bow and a closed quiver, as if preparing to fight on a battlefield. In fact, as he moves, the arrows rumble in his quiver, as if in a hurry to get out and rush towards their target. Apollo looks like the knight as he walks towards the camp of the Achaeans. The analogy is more than revealing. The word night is often used to denote anything dark and terrible. In Homer, we find the word associated with death. Night of Edis, night of death. Homer again calls a night like Kira or whole, that is destructive, deadly. Therefore, the angry Apollo descends like a deadly night. It looks like the night of death. It brings death. And when he stops and drops the first arrow, also poison, mournful wailing comes out of his silver bow. Woe to mourn, sound terrible, terrible, horrible, wild, cruel sound of death. We are now almost certain that Apollo is here the god of death. It hits the dogs and mules first, and immediately afterwards he throws his bitter spears at the people. The poet starts with the least important subject, the beating of the dogs, which have minimal value for the Achaeans, proceeds to the most important, the beating of the mules, which are valuable for the soldiers, and ends with the most important, the beating of the people themselves. In other words, he uses the law of three, dogs, mules, and people. Aero Ekepekis unleashes the terrible god against the Achaeans, arrow that is sharp, piercing, but also bitter as medicine, as poison, or as bitter as death. And here comes the last verse to dispel any doubt. Quote, and the fires of the dead are burning. The fires of the dead, the funeral fires, were burning incessantly. End quote. And dense, that is many, close to each other, were the fires, and they were burning incessantly, so the dead were many, too many. So we have an image in which death dominates from the first verse to the last, but how masterfully Homer paints this horrible image in 9 whole verses from verse 43 to 51. Death is not mentioned anywhere clearly. It is submitted indirectly and in fact gradually in stages. Even in verse 10:52, we do not hear the word death. We only see the fires of the dead burning dense and incessantly. Death is God himself, Apollo. In other words, it is a divine death, a divine punishment. And this I've translated for you from a Greek article. Please leave your comments and thank you for your support. Kindly support my Patreon account. The daily posts are 5 videos daily, and they are totally different from what I have on my YouTube channel. Thank you so much for your support and that you find all my content so interesting. You'll find the Patreon account details in the description box below.